Stillness is often misunderstood as inactivity, as if nothing is happening within it. But true stillness is not lifeless. It is charged with intention. It is the space between the notes in music, the pause before the arrow is released. In stillness, the world does not stop. It simply no longer controls your rhythm. That is where your own energy begins to rise, not in motion, but in rootedness. When the body becomes still, the breath deepens. And with that breath, the mind begins to settle. In this state, awareness sharpens. You notice sensations that were previously buried under speed and sound. You begin to observe the patterns of your thoughts, the texture of your emotions, and the reactions that once passed unnoticed. This alertness is not passive. It is precise and powerful. Stillness invites you to drop below the surface of reactivity. In that space, you begin to distinguish between noise and necessity. You no longer move because something external demands it. You move because something internal directs it. Your actions become deliberate, anchored not in impulse, but in insight. That is the strength of stillness. It transforms reaction into response. There is a strength in restraint that rushing will never teach. In stillness, you are not controlled by urgency. You become the observer, and from that place, you gain authority over your own energy. The external world may continue its rapid pace, but you are no longer carried by its current. You choose when to step in and when to remain in calm watchfulness. Just as the mountain appears unmoving yet shapes the weather around it, true stillness influences more than it resists. Others may perceive quiet as weakness, but that is because they have only known power through noise. Stillness carries a different kind of presence, one that does not need to assert itself because it is already whole. Stillness is not the absence of activity, but the purity of undivided presence. Every breath becomes intentional. Every thought is seen, not chased. This creates a state of high sensitivity without emotional disturbance. You sense everything, but you are bound to nothing. It is this level of presence that becomes unshakable, not because it blocks the world out, but because it lets everything pass through without disturbance. In moments of stillness, you meet yourself without masks. There is no performance, no narrative to maintain, only awareness. What you find there is not emptiness, but potential. Like water that appears calm on the surface, yet holds the force to shape landscapes. Stillness conceals a power that moves without being loud. This is where strength matures, not in what can be shown, but in what is sustained silently within. The ability to hold silence, to sit with tension without needing to dissolve it, to be fully aware without having to intervene. This is the mastery that grows in stillness. Focusing inward is not an escape. It is a return to the only place where clarity, healing, and true change begin. When you direct your attention within, you begin to recognize how much energy was being scattered, reacting to opinions, defending against misunderstandings, chasing validation, resisting discomfort. The moment that attention turns inward, the leaking stops and a new kind of awareness begins. Every reaction carries a cost. It takes from your breath, your time, your peace, and often the triggers are not new. They are echoes. When the same pattern repeats, it is not because life is unkind, but because life is trying to show you where you still respond unconsciously. To focus inward is to pause and study the pattern, not from a place of judgment, but from a place of refinement. Refinement does not shout, it listens. It watches closely how the mind moves, how emotion builds, how the body tenses. It becomes familiar with your own internal mechanics. In this observation, you stop being surprised by your reactions and start understanding them. The energy that once exploded outward is now held with discipline and used to sharpen awareness. Like the sword in the fire, you remain still not because you are passive, but because you are preparing. Focusing inward teaches you to act without urgency, to respond without haste. The external event no longer pulls you into immediate motion. There is a space now, a breath, between the event and your choice. In that space, mastery grows. When you turn inward consistently, your responses evolve. No longer born of defense or pride, they emerge from understanding. You are not avoiding life, you are aligning with it. The refinement comes not from suppressing what you feel, but from channeling it through wisdom rather than instinct. You move with less noise but greater impact. Focusing inward also reveals your true priorities. You begin to see what matters to your growth and what merely distracts. The things that used to provoke you now reveal their insignificance. The people who used to drain you no longer find a reaction. Not because you don't care, but because you now care in a way that doesn't require noise or explanation. The more time you spend inward, the more sensitive you become to your own state. You recognize when energy is rising, when judgment is forming, when tension is building. But instead of reacting outwardly, you meet it internally. That pause, that conscious breath, becomes the gate through which chaos is refined into calm understanding. This inward focus becomes your discipline. It is not always comfortable, because it reveals what you used to hide behind activity or distraction. But within that discomfort lies the path to precision. You are not trying to control everything. You are learning to control where your energy goes, and in doing so, you stop feeding reaction and begin cultivating refinement. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the space where deeper truths begin to emerge. When you stop speaking, you start listening in a different way, not just to others, but to yourself. The noise of explanation fades, and what remains is the presence of what's real. In silence, there is no performance, only presence. And it is in presence that clarity begins to form. Words can be used to protect, to distract, to justify, or to impress. They build walls of meaning that sometimes shield what we don't want to be seen. But silence removes that shelter. It doesn't give you something new, it simply exposes what is already there. When you allow yourself to sit in that stillness, you begin to notice what you've been avoiding through speech. Much of what we say is a way of controlling how others perceive us. Through stories, opinions, and declarations, we shape our image, but in silence, that image dissolves. You can no longer hide behind narrative or charm. What remains is your actual state, your fears, your longings, your intentions. Silence brings them to the surface without judgment, only truth. To remain silent in the face of discomfort is a discipline. The urge to defend, to correct, to explain, it is strong. But when you hold silence instead, you gain access to a different kind of strength. You begin to notice how much energy goes into being understood and how little into understanding. That reversal is where depth is born. Silence also creates space for others to reveal themselves. Without interruption, without steering the conversation, you see how people speak from their own minds, not in reaction to yours. You hear their fears, their gaps, their truths. You begin to perceive beyond the content of their words and into the quality of their being. Silence becomes a mirror that shows not just your reflection, but theirs too. There is also an inner silence that is even more revealing. It is the silence between your thoughts, the gap between impulses. When you begin to rest in that gap, you realize that not every thought needs to be followed, not every emotion needs to be voiced. The silence holds them gently, and in that stillness, some of them dissolve on their own. What words may try to conceal, silence uncovers through attention. You start noticing the weight behind your words, the reasons you speak, the moments when silence feels threatening. And you begin to see that the truth does not need to shout. It does not even need to be spoken. It simply needs to be recognized, and often that recognition begins in quiet. In silence, there is no need to win, to convince, or to persuade. There is only the unfolding of what is. What is unresolved comes forward. What is hidden comes into view, and what is unnecessary falls away. The more you chase things outside yourself, the more restless you become. It begins as a search for fulfillment, a goal, a title, a recognition, but slowly becomes a cycle that feeds its own hunger. You reach for one thing only to realize it wasn't enough. You achieve, but the satisfaction is temporary. What moves faster than your accomplishments is the desire behind them, always just ahead, always out of reach. The outer world is filled with reflections of your inner state. When you are unsettled within, you see scarcity in abundance, threat in opportunity, judgment in silence. Your perception colors your world, and the more you search for peace in external form, the more you become dependent on circumstances. It is a race that never truly ends because its starting point was never steady. To cultivate within means to sit with yourself long enough to meet what you have been avoiding. The loneliness you try to escape through constant activity. The inadequacy you try to hide through achievement. The fear you try to silence with distraction. These inner conditions are not enemies, they are messages, and until they are heard, the chase outside will only grow louder. As you begin to work inwardly, something begins to shift. You stop needing so much from others. You stop searching for constant affirmation. What you used to expect from the world, you now start to provide for yourself. Presence, attention, acceptance. It is not that the outer world changes immediately, but your relationship to it does. It no longer defines you, it reflects you. The stillness that grows inside you becomes the anchor. Now, when things around you move fast, you don't lose your ground. You observe instead of react. You understand instead of control. What once disturbed you now passes by like wind across water, felt but not held. This inner cultivation is not a retreat from life. It is a deepening into it. When you are full within, outer desires lose their urgency. You may still work, build, connect, but not out of lack. Your actions come from a place of clarity, not craving. What you chased before now comes to you, not because you forced it, but because your presence begins to attract what aligns with your inner state. The need to chase fades because peace is no longer conditional. This does not mean the world stops offering challenges, but you stop mistaking those challenges as proof of your worth. You engage with the world without losing yourself in it. Your success is not defined by applause. Your path is not dictated by trends. You move from intention rather than reaction, and in doing so, you regain the energy that used to scatter in pursuit. What once felt urgent begins to quiet, not because life becomes easier, but because your inner cultivation becomes stronger. The storm outside no longer determines your steps. You carry your own weather. You trust your own timing. You no longer reach outward for what can only be built inward. Solitude is the forge where raw impulse is melted down and shaped into deliberate intent. Removed from applause and critique, you hear the quiet rhythm of your own breath against the walls of thought. And within that cadence, the first outlines of mastery appear in the hush of being alone. The senses reorganize. Vision sharpens not because there is more to see, but because there is less to distract. The grain of wood beneath your fingertips, the slight variance in your pulse after each inhalation. These subtle cues become teachers that crowds cannot provide. Deep observation is the magnifying glass that turns moments into manuscripts. A single repetition of movement reveals layers, alignment, tension, release, recovery. Seen once, it is simple. Seen 1,000 times, it becomes an atlas of nuance impossible to map without patient study. Honest solitude exposes the stories you tell yourself. Every justification, every hidden fear, Every borrowed ambition surfaces when there is no audience to impress. In this unfiltered mirror, pretense drops away, leaving only the material from which genuine skill can be carved. Practice inside this stillness is unhurried yet relentless. You return to the same step, the same phrase, the same breath until the unnecessary falls off like slag. What remains is not just repetition, but refinement, the slow distillation of motion into essence. Observation then extends outward. The wind teaches timing, the sound of distant traffic teaches rhythm, the flicker of a candle teaches subtle shifts in balance. The world becomes a vast dojo, but it is solitude that unlocked your capacity to learn from it. As perception widens, the line between observer and observed thins. You feel the pulse of muscle before it moves, sense the arc of thought before it speaks. Mastery is no longer about controlling outcomes, but about harmonizing with forces already in motion. Solitude and deep observation cycle endlessly. Retreat to listen, emerge to apply, retreat again to correct, each phase folding back into the next until the craft itself becomes a living meditation. And observation remains the pulse beneath every movement.